There is another Spider season headed to Marvel Snap in June, headlined by exactly who you think. Yes, it's Spider-Man Brand New Day. Now, I've taken the liberty of mocking up what this card may look like. My artistic skills are unimpeachable. All seriousness, Spider-Man Brand New Day does look pretty compelling. It's a 1/2 with the ability to move twice, and whenever it moves, it gives +1 power to a card at the location it moves to, which means that it should be about a 1/4, but that's not all. It gives that power even if the card is face down. So this means that it can buff a Maverick on turn 3, which is quite important because the way move works, it actually wouldn't be able to do that without those clauses on it. Being able to hit those face down cards makes this card play out more efficiently than it otherwise would. Otherwise, you'd have to move stuff on turn 4 to buff the cards you hit on turn 3. The fact that it can hit face down cards also means that you can do something like move it to a location where there is a face down brood, for example, have it hit the brood, and then unlike most other buffs that can happen to a card, since it hits the brood face down, it will give the broodlings +1 power, so you'll be turning brood into a 3/9 just flat out. At baseline, the rate here is better than Nightcrawler if you can just move it twice, comparable to a Hydra Bob. So I see a future for a card like this in a world where we are looking at doing most things. When I look at this card looks to me like it has a very real chance to be the Hydra Bob at 1/5 of this 1-drop cohort. The issue 1-drops have is that there really aren't a lot of them that are just doing good stats because they're 1-drops. And so you have the ability with a card like this to A, put the stats where they matter, and B, not be that far below rate when it isn't necessarily doing that. I think it compares very favorably to Nightcrawler, which is a card that Supergiant decks play. This does seem like the kind of card that would be extremely powerful in a similar role. Now, there are going to be a little bit of downsides that you're going to have to avoid, like playing this on the final turn of the game is worse than Nightcrawler. No real arguments there. But throughout the majority of the game, this card ends up better than Nightcrawler. So I would guess that it ends up better than Nightcrawler and becomes the default 1-cost stat stick in those Supergiant decks. I think that's a very real possibility. Now, the probably more exciting thing to do with this is to make it part of what I like to affectionately call the buff slop archetype, the archetype of the Datamine Jeff the baby land shark, where everything gets +1 when you play it there, and then this is running around giving buffs, and suddenly I have like a hybrid buff slop and Batroc deck. That seems like a pretty compelling direction to go because not only does this move, Jeff moves too, gives you a lot of additional points in a package that looks pretty compelling as is. And this also means that you're going to be able to do interesting stuff in a purely dedicated buff deck with more options that can help you curve out in the early game. A lot of the beach season is buff related. Jubilee and Namor are buff related cards. We already talked about Jeff. So getting this as like a sort of capstone almost on that beach season that comes out just before this does seem like if the buff deck isn't going to work when it has all of this stuff, it's not going to work ever. But it's getting maybe 4 new cards over the course of June and into July if you count this one. Next up, another card that has not had art datamined for it yet, so once again, I took the liberty. This is Scorpion Brand New Day, a 6/7 with an ongoing ability that doubles the afflictions on all enemy cards. This is a pretty compelling card in a general sense. A lot of what the Afflict deck can do is use things like Anti-Venom and the newly released Polaris to make a card like this not actually cost anything. And it has, a bit of a sub-theme of I cheat stuff into play once you really take those 2 cards into account. And this is a very powerful thing to do. I do look at it and wonder, though, is this meaningfully better than something like Ajax? Like, if you think about what Ajax does, it kind of already has this text. It looks at all the afflicts and you get an extra point for the afflicts, right? Like it's not distributed, but it is a 5/7. And so when I look at this card, I'm like, it sure seems to me that this compares unfavorably with Ajax unless you put a huge premium, an energy's worth of premium on I am confident that splitting up this power that I'm doing is going to matter more. So, it also works with cards that aren't just Ajax, right? Like, it's not really fair to do just the Ajax comparison. That's really only true with Hazmat, right? But, like, if you get Man-Thing, that's obviously more effective with this than with Ajax. If you're doing Omega Sentinel, Caliban, those are the things where this card really actually starts to make a notable difference between it and Ajax. The issue is I'm just not sure those things are particularly good. Maybe there'll be some other kind of afflict deck by the time this card comes out, where you're doing Caliban, you're doing Omega Sentinel, you're doing this, and you're just like minus 14ing a bunch of stuff instead of turning your -1s into -2s. That's a very real possibility. I don't think I have a lot of faith in a deck like that long term because so much of its output is, Luke Cageable, but you could say that about the normal afflict deck and it would still be true. And so I think that this card is reasonably exciting enough, but it feels like it's a little bit low on the power scale to me. Like, this card compares too closely to Ajax for me to be happy paying an extra energy for it. I do like that it does go in an archetype that with Polaris and Anti-Venom is like meaningfully cheating and meaningfully doing stuff that does matter in terms of doing that. As always, I could probably talk about Luke Cage for a little bit, but I'll just sort of do my like 2-sentence spiel on Luke Cage. Until he's not what he says right now, I don't know that this kind of strategy will ever be able to be a top tier strategy in Marvel Snap. And in fact, I strongly suspect that it will not. But it is possible maybe it can get up to sort of fringe tier 2 gimmick status as long as nobody is seriously targeting it, because the premium for putting Luke Cage in your deck is actually pretty high right now. Did move decks just hit the jackpot with Mary Jane, a 3/3 that has an end of turn ability that gives +1 power to every card that you moved this turn. So every move you make, she'll be watching you. And this to me reads like either worse Hydra Stomper or better Hydra Stomper, depending on how it's played, which is a very reasonable thing for it to be. Hydra Stomper, of course, ongoing. The power is located on the Hydra Stomper, and it doesn't have to be on the board in order for you to start accruing this, but it has a similar dynamic where it's effectively giving you an extra point every time you move stuff. So I do think Hydra Stomper is the likely comp here. What we've seen from Hydra Stomper is it showing up in Batroc stuff rather than it showing up in Heimdall type stuff. That is perhaps informative here. I would play 2 Hydra Stompers in that deck if I had the ability to play 2 Hydra Stompers in that deck. I do think it's a very reasonable way to approach it, but I also think that Hydra Stomper will end up being a more important part of that deck because it is able to go taller, and because a lot of the way people try to beat a deck like that is by invalidating the early scalers. So part of what you do when you're looking to beat a Batroc deck is you play Elektra and Killmonger and Gambit, right? And this card doesn't really play around that in a meaningful way. In fact, it plays into that by putting more points on the Batroc, right? Like, that is notably not great. And instead of that, you have, a Hydra Stomper where all the points are located in it. It's the ability to go tall as compared to the ability to go wide, and it works retroactively instead of just being on the board. So when I do the comparison and I stack them up and think about how these cards are going to play out, I suspect that Hydra Stomper is a better standalone card. But this card also maybe works with a card that was data mined for the month before this to come out in June, and that is the card Venus, which doubles the buff that whenever a card gets +1 power, it gets an additional +1 power. And suddenly maybe like, you do this, you do Venus, you do Heimdall or something, starts to look a little bit more appealing. +2ing your board starts to look a little bit more appealing. My instinct is that kind of stuff is a bit low power right now. We're just not really in a metagame that cares about that stuff, but it's possible that the metagame ends up differently if we end up in a relatively low power metagame, one that is driven by, big cards that are preventing combos from getting over the top. We've been in metagames metagames like that before, it does seem like the kind of relatively fair but unfair kind of thing that could end up working well. Largely, I think this card is worse Hydra Stomper, but it does tie in better with a bunch of boost cards that are coming out in the previous month. Tarantula, look at those shoes, is an end of turn card with an additional condition. If you have the highest power card, he gets +1 power, and 2 cards in your hand get +1 power. I look at this card and it is quite interesting because at 2-1, it feels like what this card is actually saying is play Hydra Bob first. You play that Hydra Bob on the board, this is probably triggering immediately, and then you might be able to, I don't know, Wilson Fisk. I am compelled by the idea of Hydra Bob this Wilson Fisk. It does lose if your opponent plays a lizard, but there is some compelling bit going on there for me. Largely, though, this card seems like kind of a nightmare to balance. This does not seem like a card that you would ever be happy with as a developer if it was triggering constantly, because that just sort of runs a bunch of energy into the game, or a bunch of points into the game that are not easy to interact with, not easy to stop, and generally are probably a little free if this guy is triggering himself. So you start him at a low power and then he's not triggering himself, and then you're really relying on him to get maybe one trigger off, and that one trigger to be the difference that allows for more triggers. And I think that reminds me a little bit too much about Viv Vision. The numbers on Viv Vision had to go up pretty significantly from what they thought they were to what they actually were to make Viv Vision a playable card. Like, that is a 3-4 now that came out as a 3-2. Its numbers had to double. And a lot of that is just, this is not the world's most valuable way to get 2 extra points. That's kind of the thing you run into here, is like, if I wanted to go get 2 extra points, why wouldn't I just play Viv Vision? Is there a compelling reason why my priority deck would be doing this instead of playing a lizard and then a Viv Vision? Is there a good reason for that? And the more I sort of run through these scenarios, the more I'm like, I can't really find one. This card strikes me as a card that is a little bit too weak to do what it's meant to do. And it's also the kind of card that if I were them, I'd be pretty scared of making too strong. It's a very interesting card where if this card ends up too strong, it's just, you know, accruing value forever. It's a really unpleasant gameplay experience. And so they made it pretty hard for it to turn itself on. And now I look at it and I'm like, I don't know if I can ever justify putting this card in a deck. It definitely strikes me as a card that is off in some way and probably will not be a meaningful participant in the metagame unless something about it changes. Last up is Boomerang, a 2-1 with one of the coolest abilities I've ever seen. When he returns to hand, he steals 4 power from cards in your opponent's hand. He can activate once and send himself back to hand. At 2-1, this is a card that is a bounce target. We've never really gotten a card like this before. We've gotten cards that are bounce targets in sort of how they typically are played. A lot of ones that have repeatable and good on reveals get regarded as bounce targets, right? A lot of things that are good on reveals that you would like to happen again are going to be things that are bounce targets. But we've never had a card that is, I only work if I'm being bounced. Beast me, toxin me, and then also do this. I mean, Steal 4 is really big text. You play this on 2, you activate it on 3, you play it on 4 with a toxin, you play it on 5 with a beast. Seems like the kind of thing you could do. More likely, though, my guess is you play this on 2, activate it at some point, and then play it with a beast is sort of where my head is at. Because the thing that strikes me about this card is that it costs 2. And it's not like it's getting any cheaper. You're paying 2 every time you want to do this. And normally every other card in the bounce deck that is kind of like this, that you want to be repeatedly bouncing, that isn't like, you know, Hitmonkey, Sage, stuff like that, it ends up being the kind of card that costs 1, because that is where you get the most ability to replay them. So how much of my curve is this guy going to take up? If I play him and bounce him and replay him, I'm spending 4 energy. If I get that bounce again, I'm spending 6 energy. Because he's not an on reveal and he triggers when you bounce him, and then you have to replay him in order to realize the gains from the previous cycle, I think he might play a little bit smaller than he reads, but I'm still pretty compelled and excited because the number on this card is just really, really crazy. Stealing 4 power, okay, that's obviously a big number. Being able to repeat that and have it affect the hand, yeah, that's a little bit worse than if it was affecting the board, but there is a point at which that disruption is super meaningful. Not necessarily to decks that are going to be able to combine the text of their cards and go over the top. You're still probably not going to feel very good about beating a deck that's doing an Invisible Woman First Steps combo, even if the Invisible Woman First Steps has less power. But this does seem like the kind of thing that could make Bounce be able to win its mid-rangey matchups more. Bounce was sort of the original combo deck in Marvel Snap. The idea of Bounce, when it was a great deck, was always that it was efficient at throwing priority and dodging the dominant tech of the time, because it was efficient at throwing priority, while still reaching output that went over the top of the tech decks and sort of serving in that combo-like role, beating up on techie mid-range that we now have a bunch of decks doing. Bounce has always sort of been the smallest of those combo decks. It's a deck that is a smaller combo deck, meaning that in a combo-on-combo matchup, it typically is the one that is trying to sort of fly through, skate by the seat of its pants, basically, because it is really only going to have the disruption available to it that it has available to it. It's going to have maybe a Korg or maybe an Iceman, and then if they combo out through the Korg and the Iceman, well, they probably just have more points than you. This adds an additional disruption thing, but I don't think it's very good against combo stuff. I think this card largely shines in the areas where Bounce is already pretty good, beating up on mid-range decks. The dynamic that it has is really interesting, because you think it's going to be every time I bounce this, I get 8 power, right? I'm stealing 4. But the thing that happens when you bounce it is the afflict, and you have to replay it in order to actually get the other half of the effect. It's a really clever design in that way, I think. Like, this is definitely an interesting dynamic they've never tapped into before, and it can make a card that reads and looks like it has to be incredibly powerful. I mean, steal 4. The more you think about how it's likely to play out, the more I think this card is probably honestly pretty balanced and fine. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe. As always, I really appreciate all of the support. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one. Have a good evening.